For the hour, and we start with the ongoing escalations between the United States and Iran. Tehran has warned that any US attack, including limited strikes, would be considered an act of aggression and would prompt a response. This comes after President Donald Trump hinted at considering such a strike on Iran. Ismail Baqai, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, made the statement, stressing that any military action would escalate tensions significantly. Let's take a listen into them.
And with respect to your first question concerning the limited strike, I think there is no limited strike. An act of aggression would be regarded as an act of aggression, period. And any state would react to an act of aggression as part of its inherent right of self-defense ferociously. So that's what...
Meanwhile, in a related development, the Indian embassy in Tehran has issued an advisory warning urging Indian nationals in Iran to leave the country immediately due to rising tensions and the possibility of US strikes. The advisory applies to all Indians, including students, pilgrims, business persons and tourists. Citizens are urged to use available means of transport, such as commercial flights, and are reminded to keep their travel documents, including passports and IDs, readily accessible. The embassy also encourages registration and has provided emergency contact numbers and an email for any assistance. Joining us now to discuss the ongoing tensions between the United States and Iran is Professor Rohan Gunaratne. He's an international affairs expert joining us live from Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you on these issues. This, of course, follows the announcement that we have a third round of talks coming on Thursday. Given the escalating tensions and these statements coming from both sides, do you have any hopes for any major developments coming out of those talks in Geneva?
It's very good to see you, Thomas. What we are witnessing is there are going to be talks on Thursday, but the United States has right now deployed a third of its Navy and a third of its air capabilities in the Middle East with the intention of regime change. Of course, President Trump has openly declared that his main concerns are Iran's nuclear program to build a functional weapon. Second is, of course, its expanding missile program, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And the third is, of course, Iran's support for various terrorist proxies, notably the Lebanese Hezbollah, the Hashd Shabi in Iraq, and Ansarullah of the Houthi movement in Yemen. But what we are seeing is the problem is much greater than that. That is, as long as the Ayatollahs are in charge of Iran, there will be suppression of its own civilian population. And very significant percentage of civilians have now turned against the regime. So President Trump has made a request that Iran hands over the enriched uranium and dismantles its uranium, its nuclear program completely. And the Iranians are unwilling to do that.
And Professor, talks of a limited strike are floating around, possibly something like we saw in Caracas in Venezuela, which of course did not lead to conflict. However, the Iranians here are saying that that would be an act of war. Do you think Donald Trump is balancing things in the correct way, approaching things with diplomacy, but also floating the aspect of serious military intervention here? A limited strike could not be so limited, possibly, something that could spiral into something much, much bigger.
What President Trump means by a limited strike is to attack the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps infrastructure that is sustaining the nuclear and the missile and the program to support the terrorist proxies. But certainly that itself is insufficient. There needs to be what you call a regime change. And as long as there's no regime change, the threat will continue from Iran. So if if the Iranian regime is unwilling to concede, then of course the US will do a major attack and ensure that either Ayatollah Khamenei is surgically extracted, like what they did with Maduro, or they will certainly ensure that there is a new regime in power in Iran.
And of course, the Iranians have made statements saying that they are willing to negotiate enrichment. However, what is off the table is its missiles and its support for regional proxies in negotiating. Is a decline in nuclear enrichment feasible to bring to the table when it comes to stopping the Americans from striking militarily? Or is that simply not enough for the Americans at the negotiating table?
That is the very first request that has been made, but there are many others. I think that is the first pillar of negotiation, because that is the challenge for the United States and the rest of the world. Because if Iran develops a functional nuclear weapon, there'll be arms race in the Middle East, and there will be other countries that will attempt to develop nuclear capabilities.
Professor Rohan Gunaratne, thank you so much for joining us.